The wind came first, bending the prairie grass flat against the earth until it looked like the land itself was trying to hide. Dust rose in spirals thick enough to choke on, and the sky above hung yellow and bruised, a sickly dawn that promised nothing good. Winter had not yet arrived, but its shadow stretched long across the plains, cold and patient and certain. The wagon sat crooked in the ditch where the axle had snapped hours before. One wheel lay half submerged in frozen mud, the spokes cracked clean through. The mare stood nearby, ribs pressing through her dull coat head, low ears flicking at the wind. She had given everything she had, and still it had not been enough. Margaret Brennan stood a few feet from the wreckage, her back to the wind, her skirt weighted with frost. Her hands hung at her sides, knuckles split and raw from the cold. She had stopped moving sometime in the night, not from exhaustion, though that had come, but from the slow understanding that moving no longer mattered. The road stretched east behind her like a scar, empty and indifferent. No houses, no barns, no smoke rising from distant chimneys. Just the shape of the world in its most honest form, wide and waiting and utterly unconcerned with whether she lived or died. On a bed of broken stalks beside the wagon, her son huddled beneath a threadbare blanket. Daniel was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and boots that had holes in both soles. He had stopped asking questions the night before. Now he only watched her with those free-eyed, serious eyes, waiting for her to tell him what came next. As if she knew. As if any of this had ever been part of a plan. The boy stirred, pulling the blanket tighter. His voice came soft, almost lost beneath the wind. "Ma, you think that man's still coming?" She did not answer right away. The wind spoke louder, and for a moment she let it. Then she turned slowly, her face pale and tight, hunger and fear carved too deep to hide. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words had dried up somewhere between her throat and her chest. Hope required energy she no longer had. Then hoofbeats, faint at first, muffled by the wind, but growing. The mare lifted her head. Daniel sat up straight to her, his eyes finding hers. Margaret did not move. Could not. She had learned not to trust the sound of men approaching. The rider came into view over the ridge, just a shape against the pale sky, at first long and steady. He rode alone, hat pulled low, oilskin coat dark with the cold. The horse beneath him was black and thick-necked, its legs caked with road mud. He did not rush, did not wave. He simply saw them and kept riding slow and even until he came to the edge of the ditch. He looked down at the wagon, at the broken wheel, at the mare, at the boy. Then his eyes met hers, and she felt something shift in the air between them. Not recognition, not pity, something quieter than that. He dismounted without a word, tying the reins to a low branch, and walked over to the wagon. His boots made deep prints in the wet earth. Still he said nothing. She watched him crouch beside the wheel, running a hand over the splintered wood. His hands were large, sun-dark, the kind that had spent years working with tools and soil and things that did not break easily. He tapped the hub with his knuckles, testing the damage, then stood. "You alone?" She hesitated, then nodded. He glanced at the boy. "Your son?" She nodded again. The words were there somewhere, but they would not come. He looked back at the wheel, then at the road, then at the sky. His jaw tightened. That won't ride again without a new axle. Wagon's done for. She knew that already. Had known it since the crack echoed across the prairie hours ago. Still hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach twist. She had no money for a new wagon, no way to reach Jackson, no plan beyond the one that had just died at her feet. The man rubbed his jaw, then walked back to his horse and untied a small canvas bundle from the saddle horn. He carried it to the boy and handed it over, his movements careful, deliberate. "Bread and jerky. Eat slow." Daniel looked up at her, uncertainty written across his face. She gave the smallest nod, and the boy opened the cloth like it was Christmas morning. The smell of smoked meat hit the air, and Margaret's stomach clenched so hard she thought she might be sick. She could not remember the last time they had eaten anything that was not boiled grain or stale crackers. The man turned back to her, his eyes steady. "You got anywhere to be?" Her mouth was dry, but she managed to speak. "We were headed west. Friend said there was work in Jackson." He studied her face for a long moment, reading things she had not said. "Jackson's near 70 miles from here. Too far to walk, and this road won't bring much traffic." "Not this time of year." She lowered her eyes. "I know." He looked past her out at the broken sky. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. My ranch is north of here. 20 miles. Not much, but I've got shelter and feed. Could use a hand if you know how to cook and keep a fire lit. She said nothing. The offer hung between them, strange and impossible. She had learned not to trust kindness from men. Kindness always came with a price. He waited a moment, then added, his tone flat and practical. You can ride with me or wait here for someone else. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, not from cold, just the slow collapse of everything she had tried to hold together for so long. Her voice came out, cracked and broken. Why he did not blink. Because I've seen that look before. On my sister's face. The day her husband left. The wind rose again, sharp and biting. Her skirt slapped against her legs like a warning. She turned toward the boy, watching him chew slowly, his eyes wide with something that might have been hope. She swallowed hard, then met the stranger's eyes again. Will he be safe? The man gave the smallest smile, and for the first time she saw something human in his face. Not warmth exactly, but something close. Yes, starting now. The ride was longer than she expected. The road turned to ruts, then to nothing but pale prairie grass underfoot, brittle from the cold. The man rode ahead on foot, leading his horse by the bridle without complaint, his boots crunching through frost-bitten weeds. She and Daniel sat together in the saddle, the boy curled against her chest, his breath warm against her neck. The stranger had offered her the saddle without a word, simply lifting Daniel up and then helping her mount before taking up the reins and walking. The land stretched in every direction, silent and stripped bare. No fences marked borders. No smoke hinted at neighbors. Just endless earth and sky, and one man leading a woman and her son towards something she could not yet name. Her legs ached from riding, her spine stiff, but she said nothing. Pride maybe, or weariness so deep that words no longer mattered. The wind pressed against them, constant and unforgiving. She watched the man's back as he walked, the broad set of his shoulders, the slight limp in his left leg that he tried to hide. He had not asked her name, had not asked where she came from or what she was running from, and she had not offered. Some things were better left unspoken, at least for now. Just past noon, the house came into view. Not large. Nothing more than a weather-worn cabin with a lean-to barn and a fenced corral. A few chickens scattered near the door, pecking at seeds scattered across the dirt. The roof sagged on one side and the chimney listed slightly, but smoke curled from it, thin and steady. It was not much, but it stood. And in that moment, that was enough. He helped her down first, his hands firm but careful, then lifted Daniel from the saddle. The boy clung to him a moment longer than necessary, and the man did not rush him. He simply held the child steady, waiting until Daniel was ready to let go. You'll want to warm up. I'll tend to the horse. She nodded, her legs nearly buckling as they took her weight. She steadied herself against the porch rail and guided Daniel toward the door. The wood creaked as she pushed it open, and the warmth inside hit her like a blow. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting orange light across the room. The smell of pine smoke and boiled beans filled the air, simple and clean. One room, one bed pushed against the far wall, a table with two chairs, a battered trunk near the window. No sign of a woman's touch, no lace, no soft things, just survival stripped down to its essentials. She sank into the nearest chair, and Daniel curled into her lap without asking, his eyes already closing. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe they might be all right. The man entered soon after the door closing with a gust of wind behind him. He removed his coat and hung it on a peg, then crossed to the stove without a word. He fetched a tin bowl, poured hot water from a kettle, and set it on the table between them. For your hands. She stared at the steam rising from the bowl, then slowly reached forward, dipping her fingers in. The heat made her flinch. Her skin was cracked, the knuckles split and bleeding. The water stung, but it felt like being remembered, like being seen. The man pulled a tin of salve from a cupboard and placed it beside the bowl. My ma used to make that, tallow and pine resin. Heals quicker than you'd think. She glanced up at him, searching for some hidden intent, some expectation, but found none. He simply crouched near the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames snapped and shifted, throwing shadows across the walls. I'll sleep in the barn. You two take the bed. She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. I've done worse in colder places. Besides, the boy needs rest. You do too. A silence settled over the room. Not awkward, just real. He did not look at her the way other men had, with that weight in their gaze, that demand. There was no hunger in his eyes, no expectation, just a man who had seen something in her that needed shelter and had chosen to offer it. She nodded, unable to find words. He stood brushing ash from his hands. "Name's Ethan." She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Margaret." Her voice broke slightly. "And this is Daniel. He's 8. Ethan nodded once, like he had filed it away somewhere safe. Outside, the wind picked up again. The windows shivered in their frames, and night came fast, swallowing the last of the light. Ethan moved toward the door, pulling his coat back on. "Eat what you can. I'll bring in another log later." He stepped outside before she could thank him again, the door closing softly behind him. Daniel slept deeply now, his cheek pressed against her arm, his breathing slow and even. She laid him down gently on the bed, tucking the rough wool blanket tight around him. He did not stir. Then she stood alone in the small room, her eyes tracing the cracks in the wall, the ash marks near the hearth, the single mug beside the stove. Every detail told a story of someone who had lived long with silence and had made peace with it. She moved to the window and looked out into the gathering dark. Across the yard, a lantern glowed through the cracks in the barn boards, casting thin lines of light into the night. She could see Ethan's shadow moving inside, tending to the horse, settling in for a cold night alone. She touched her fingertips to the glass. The cold bit back sharp and unforgiving, but inside the fire still burned. She turned away from the window and returned to the bed, lying down beside Daniel, careful not to wake him. She pulled the blanket over them both and closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl outside. For the first time in months, she felt something close to safety. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. And for tonight, that was enough. The wind came first, bending the prairie grass flat against the earth until it looked like the land itself was trying to hide. Dust rose in spirals thick enough to choke on, and the sky above hung yellow and bruised, a sickly dawn that promised nothing good. Winter had not yet arrived, but its shadows stretched long across the plains, cold and patient and certain. The wagon sat crooked in the ditch where the axle had snapped hours before. One wheel lay half submerged in frozen mud. The spokes cracked clean through. The mare stood nearby, ribs pressing through her dull coat head, low ears flicking at the wind. She had given everything she had, and still it had not been enough. Margaret Brennan stood a few feet from the wreckage, her back to the wind, her skirt weighted with frost. Her hands hung at her sides, knuckles split and raw from the cold. She had stopped moving sometime in the night, not from exhaustion, though that had come, but from the slow understanding that moving no longer mattered. The road stretched east behind her like a scar, empty and indifferent. No houses, no barns, no smoke rising from distant chimneys. Just the shape of the world in its most honest form, wide and waiting and utterly unconcerned with whether she lived or died. On a bed of broken stalks beside the wagon, her son huddled beneath a threadbare blanket. Daniel was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and boots that had holes in both soles. He had stopped asking questions the night before. Now he only watched her with those wide-eyed, serious eyes, waiting for her to tell him what came next, as if she knew, as if any of this had ever been part of a plan. The boy stirred, pulling the blanket tighter. His voice came soft, almost lost beneath the wind. "Ma, you think that man's still coming?" She did not answer right away. The wind spoke louder, and for a moment she let it. Then she turned slowly, her face pale and tight, hunger and fear carved too deep to hide. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words had dried up somewhere between her throat and her chest. Hope required energy she no longer had. Then hoofbeats, faint at first, muffled by the wind, but growing. The mare lifted her head. Daniel sat up straighter, his eyes finding hers. Margaret did not move. Could not. She had learned not to trust the sound of men approaching. The rider came into view over the ridge, just a shape against the pale sky, at first long and steady. He rode alone, hat pulled low, oilskin coat dark with the cold. The horse beneath him was black and thick-necked, its legs caked with road mud. He did not rush, did not wave. He simply saw them and kept riding slow and even until he came to the edge of the ditch. He looked down at the wagon, at the broken wheel, at the mare, at the boy. Then his eyes met hers, and she felt something shift in the air between them. Not recognition, not pity, something quieter than that. He dismounted without a word, tying the reins to a low branch, and walked over to the wagon. His boots made deep prints in the wet earth. Still he said nothing. She watched him crouch beside the wheel, running a hand over the splintered wood. His hands were large, sun-dark, the kind that had spent years working with tools and soil and things that did not break easily. He tapped the hub with his knuckles, testing the damage, then stood. "You alone." She hesitated, then nodded. He glanced at the boy. "Your son." She nodded again. The words were there somewhere, but they would not come. He looked back at the wheel, then at the road, then at the sky. His jaw tightened. That won't ride again without a new axle. Wagon's done for. She knew that already. Had known it since the crack echoed across the prairie hours ago. Still hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach twist. She had no money for a new wagon. No way to reach Jackson. No plan beyond the one that had just died at her feet. The man rubbed his jaw, then walked back to his horse and untied a small canvas bundle from the saddle horn. He carried it to the boy and handed it over, his movements, careful, deliberate. "Bread and jerky, eat slow." Daniel looked up at her, uncertainty written across his face. She gave the smallest nod, and the boy opened the cloth like it was Christmas morning. The smell of smoked meat hit the air, and Margaret's stomach clenched so hard she thought she might be sick. She could not remember the last time they had eaten anything that was not boiled grain or stale crackers. The man turned back to her, his eyes steady. "You got anywhere to be?" Her mouth was dry, but she managed to speak. "We were headed west. Friend said there was work in Jackson." He studied her face for a long moment, reading things she had not said. "Jackson's near 70 miles from here. Too far to walk, and this road won't bring much traffic." "Not this time of year." She lowered her eyes. "I know." He looked past her out at the broken sky. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "My ranch is north of here. 20 miles. Not much, but I've got shelter and feed. Could use a hand if you know how to cook and keep a fire lit." She said nothing. The offer hung between them, strange and impossible. She had learned not to trust kindness from men. Kindness always came with a price. He waited a moment, then added, his tone flat and practical. "You can ride with me or wait here for someone else." She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, not from cold, just the slow collapse of everything she had tried to hold together for so long. Her voice came out, cracked and broken. "Why?" He did not blink. "Because I've seen that look before. On my sister's face. The day her husband left." The wind rose again, sharp and biting. Her skirt slapped against her legs like a warning. She turned toward the boy, watching him chew slowly, his eyes wide with something that might have been hope. She swallowed hard, then met the stranger's eyes again. "Will he be safe?" The man gave the smallest smile, and for the first time she saw something human in his face. Not warmth exactly, but something close. Yes, starting now, the ride was longer than she expected. The road turned to ruts, then to nothing but pale prairie grass underfoot, brittle from the cold. The man rode ahead on foot, leading his horse by the bridle with auric complaint, his boots crunching through frost-bitten weeds. She and Daniel sat together in the saddle, the boy curled against her chest, his breath warm against her neck. The stranger had offered her the saddle without a word, simply lifting Daniel up and then helping her mount before taking up the reins and walking. The land stretched in every direction, silent and stripped bare. No fences marked borders, no smoke hinted at neighbors. Just endless earth and sky, and one man leading a woman and her son toward something she could not yet name. Her legs ached from riding, her spine stiff, but she said nothing. Pride maybe, or weariness so deep that words no longer mattered. The wind pressed against them, constant and unforgiving. She watched the man's back as he walked, the broad set of his shoulders, the slight limp in his left leg that he tried to hide. He had not asked her name, had not asked where she came from or what she was running from, and she had not offered. Some things were better left unspoken, at least for now. Just past noon, the house came into view. Not large, nothing more than a weather-worn cabin with a lean-to barn and a fenced corral. A few chickens scattered near the door, pecking at seeds scattered across the dirt. The roof sagged on one side and the chimney listed slightly, but smoke curled from it, thin and steady. It was not much, but it stood, and in that moment that was enough. He helped her down first, his hands firm but careful, then lifted Daniel from the saddle. The boy clung to him a moment longer than necessary, and The man did not rush him. He simply held the child steady, waiting until Daniel was ready to let go. "You'll want to warm up. I'll tend to the horse." She nodded, her legs nearly buckling as they took her weight. She steadied herself against the porch rail and guided Daniel toward the door. The wood creaked as she pushed it open, and the warmth inside hit her like a blow. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting orange light across the room. The smell of pine smoke and boiled beans filled the air, simple and clean. One room, one bed pushed against the far wall, a table with two chairs, a battered trunk near the window. No sign of a woman's touch. No lace, no soft things, just survival stripped down to its essentials. She sank into the nearest chair, and Daniel curled into her lap without asking, his eyes already closing. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe they might be all right. The man entered soon after the door closing, with a gust of wind behind him. He removed his coat and hung it on a peg, then crossed to the stove without a word. He fetched a tin bowl, poured hot water from a kettle, and set it on the table between them. "For your hands." She stared at the steam rising from the bowl, then slowly reached forward, dipping her fingers in. The heat made her flinch. Her skin was cracked, the knuckles split and bleeding. The water stung, but it felt like being remembered, like being seen. The man pulled a tin of salve from a cupboard and placed it beside the bowl. "My ma used to make that, tallow and pine resin. Heals quicker than you'd think." She glanced up at him, searching for some hidden intent, some expectation, but found none. He simply crouched near the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames snapped and shifted, throwing shadows across the walls. "I'll sleep in the barn. You two take the bed." She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "I've done worse in colder places. Besides, the boy needs rest." "You do too." A silence settled over the room. Not awkward, just real. He did not look at her the way other men had, with that weight in their gaze, that demand. There was no hunger in his eyes, no expectation, just a man who had seen something in her that needed shelter and had chosen to offer it. She nodded, unable to find words. He stood brushing ash from his hands. "Name's Ethan." She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Margaret." Her voice broke slightly. "And this is Daniel. He's 8. Ethan nodded once, like he had filed it away somewhere safe. Outside, the wind picked up again. The windows shivered in their frames, and night came fast, swallowing the last of the light. Ethan moved toward the door, pulling his coat back on. "Eat what you can. I'll bring in another log later." He stepped outside before she could thank him again, the door closing softly behind him. Daniel slept deeply now, his cheek pressed against her arm, his breathing slow and even. She laid him down gently on the bed, tucking the rough wool blanket tight around him. He did not stir. Then she stood alone in the small room, her eyes tracing the cracks in the wall, the ash marks near the hearth, the single mug beside the stove. Every detail told a story of someone who had lived long with silence and had made peace with it. She moved to the window and looked out into the gathering dark. Across the yard, a lantern glowed through the cracks in the barn boards, casting thin lines of light into the night. She could see Ethan's shadow moving inside, tending to the horse, settling in for a cold night alone. She touched her fingertips to the glass. The cold bit back sharp and unforgiving, but inside the fire still burned. She turned away from the window and returned to the bed, lying down beside Daniel, careful not to wake him. She pulled the blanket over them both and closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl outside. For the first time in months, she felt something close to safety. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. And for tonight, that was enough. In the morning, frost clung to the windows in feathered shapes, delicate as lace. Pale light edged through the glass, thin and cold. Margaret woke before Daniel, her back stiff from sleeping beside him, her feet still swollen from the ride. The fire had gone low, but a few coals still glowed in the grate, pulsing with faint heat. She fed it kindling and knelt close, letting the warmth touch her face. It was the first time in weeks she had felt anything close to safety. The floor creaked behind her. Ethan entered, smelling of hay and horse's steam rising from his coat. He set down a pail of water and a sack of oats, his movements efficient and practiced. "Morning." She nodded, her voice still locked somewhere in her chest. "You sleep a little." He crouched to warm his hands at the fire, his face unreadable. "I'll head out after breakfast. Need to check the west fence. Snow will take it down if it's weak." He paused, glancing at her. You feel steady enough to keep the fire and watch the boy. She nodded. I'll be back before dark. Then he stood, and something in the way he looked at her, a flicker of something she could not name, made her chest ache. Not for what he said, but for what he did not. He left with a quiet that felt too easy, like he had done this same goodbye every day of his life. The door shut behind him, and she was alone again with Daniel and the silence. Later, she found herself moving through the cabin with quiet purpose. She boiled oats and sweetened them with a pinch of molasses she found in the cupboard. She scrubbed the basin and swept out the corners. She tended to the fire like it mattered, because suddenly it did. Daniel ate without complaint, his eyes no longer so wide, no longer searching for danger in every shadow. Will we stay here now? She paused the spoon halfway to her mouth. For a while. He nodded, accepting this, the way children accept things when they have no other choice. After he fell asleep again, curled on the bed with the blanket pulled to his chin, she stepped outside. The cold sliced through her shawl, but the air was clean, bracing. The corral was empty, the pasture wide and white with frost. Far out, she saw a figure on horseback, paused at the ridge. She did not wave, but she stood there until he moved again, heading farther west, fading into the land. When he returned, it was almost night. Snow dusted his coat and his beard was wet with melt. She had stew on the stove and bread in the oven, using what little flour was left. He came in and stopped. When he smelled it, his face softening in a way she had not seen before. Hope you don't mind. You had more than enough supplies. His voice was low. I don't mind. They ate at the table, not speaking much. The fire crackled and the wind sighed at the window like it wanted to be let in. After supper, she washed the bowls while he sat near the hearth, one boot off, rubbing his ankle like it pained him. She saw the way he winced and crossed the room without thinking. You've twisted it, he shook his head. No worse than usual. She knelt beside him anyway, unrolling his sock, revealing skin scarred and discolored from some old break. Poorly healed, the bone set wrong, the tissue thick with scar. This bone was never set right, didn't have the time or the help. Her fingers hovered, unsure. I could bind it better, if you let me. He looked at her for a moment, searching her face. All right, she worked slowly, wrapping the cloth tight, careful not to hurt him. His foot was rough, calloused, but warm. Human. Real. As she tied the band, she heard his voice, low and unguarded. You from Kansas? She nodded. Thought so. That draw doesn't come from the mountains. She looked up. You've been out here long. He leaned back. Since I was 16. Ma died. Pa drank. I left. No dramatics, just facts laid bare like stones. I married at 17. She said it quietly, testing the words. He was sweet for the first year. Ethan did not press her for more. They sat in silence, not awkward, but shared like something old had settled between them, and neither had the heart to disturb it. When she stood, he did too, limping slightly. I'll take the barn again. You don't have to. The bed is big enough. His eyes searched hers, weighing the offer. All right, just that. He banked the fire while she tucked Daniel in. The boy was warm, peaceful, his breathing soft and even. When she turned back, Ethan had already laid out a blanket on the floor beside the bed. You sure? He nodded. It's just floorboards. I've had worse. She did not push it, but something in her chest tugged some part of her that had forgotten what it felt like to be treated gently. Before she climbed into bed, she paused beside him. Thank you. For all of it. He looked up at her, and his voice was nearly a whisper. You're not a burden, Margaret. You never were. The lamp dimmed, the room quieted, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself sleep without fear. The days began to fall into rhythm. Not easy. Nothing was, but steady. Margaret rose with the dark swept ash from the hearth, lit the morning fire. She boiled water, stirred oats, watched the sky shift from gray to bruised pink to pale gold. She would feed Daniel, then send him out to fetch eggs or scatter seed. He liked the chickens, said they reminded him of someone cheerful, though he could not say who. Ethan worked from sunup to near sundown, mending fences, splitting wood, fixing the barn roof before the snow grew heavy. He did not speak much, but his presence steadied the air like a beam under a sagging roof. He would come in for a midday meal, his coat smelling of horses and pine, then tip his hat to the boy and ask quiet and dry, How's the ranch foreman today? Daniel would beam, sitting a little straighter. Margaret learned the work without asking. She chopped roots for soup, stitched tears in old shirts, ground cornmeal with a stone and bowl. Her hands were always moving. She preferred it that way. Stillness let old things creep in memories she had buried deep, the weight of a fist against her ribs, the sound of breaking glass, the way fear tasted like copper on her tongue. But even with the work, the cold got in. One afternoon, the sky shifted. The wind turned sharp, and the clouds dropped low heavy with something worse than rain. Ethan came in early, shaking snow from his shoulders. Storm's coming, bad one. She glanced at the window. The glass had gone white. He crossed to the trunk, pulled out thick quilts, extra lanterns, matches. His movements were brisk, purposeful. Wood stacked in the barn, water barrels full. Should last if we're stuck a few days. Will the animals be all right? They've seen worse. He paused, met her eyes. You and the boy will stay warm, I promise. And he meant it. That was what undid her a little. The way he said things plain like truth did not need decoration. That night, the wind screamed against the walls. It shook the shutters and made the chimney moan like some lost thing. The fire held, but the cold pressed in anyway, creeping under doors, through cracks into bone. Daniel whimpered once in his sleep. Margaret gathered him close, pulled the quilt tight, then glanced at the corner where Ethan lay. He was awake. His eyes caught the light. She whispered, "Come here. There's room." He hesitated. Then he stood slow and crossed the floor in his socks. He climbed into the bed like a man walking into church. Careful, quiet, reverent. They did not speak. Just lay there, Daniel warm between them, the wind clawing at the world outside. Hours passed. Sometime before dawn, she felt his hand brush hers under the quilt. He did not take it, not fully, just let it rest beside hers open. She did not move away. The next morning, the world was buried. Snow sat heavy on every surface, a thick white silence. The barn was nearly hidden. The fence posts looked like grave markers. All sound was muffled. The wind had calmed now, but with a hush that felt like warning. Inside the cabin was warm, safer than it had any right to be. Ethan stirred the fire, then looked at her across the room. You holding up? She nodded. You? He gave a small smile. Getting there, Daniel was building something with firewood scraps in the corner. He had made a little cabin of his own, stacking logs, careful with each piece. Margaret watched him, then looked at Ethan. Can I ask you something? He leaned back against the hearth. Of course. Why did you help us that first day? He did not answer right away. His eyes stayed on the flames. Because I was raised better than how I've lived. And because someone once helped me when I was down to nothing. She waited. Don't owe them anymore. But I remember how it felt. Not being left behind. The wind pressed faintly against the walls. I never expected kindness again. He looked at her, then not with pity, but with something quieter. Like understanding. You don't have to expect it. You just have to let it in. They sat like that for a long while. The fire between them. The boy humming to himself as snow wrapped the world in white. The storm lasted 3 days. By the end of it, the woodpile had dwindled and the cabin walls creaked with the strain of cold. But they never ran out of warmth, not the kind that mattered. Margaret cooked what she could from the root cellar. Boiled potatoes with salt, a jar of preserved beans. Dried apples simmered with sugar until the scent filled the room like a memory. Daniel stayed close, quieter than usual, asking questions only now and then. What kind of bird makes tracks like that in the snow? How long until spring? What happens if the sky never clears? Margaret did not always have answers. Sometimes Ethan did. He spoke softly to the boy, never talking down to him, just offering pieces of the world the way someone might hand over a folded map. Careful, respectful, honest. On the fourth morning, the sun returned. The snow glittered like glass. The wind stilled. Steam rose from the barn roof. It looked like the land had been washed clean, even if the cold still bit through layers. Ethan saddled his horse and went to break the path out toward the main road, leaving Margaret to tend the fire and sweep the steps. When he came back, his beard was thick with frost, but his eyes held something lighter. Should be a wagon through by week's end, mail or trader, if you want to send word to anyone. She hesitated. There's no one left to send it to. He did not press. Later that day, while Daniel napped, she stood by the window, the snow up to the lower panes. Ethan was outside hauling hay with slow determination, the limp in his leg more pronounced now that the ground was uneven and slick. She watched him stumble once just slightly and reach for the post to steady himself. He stood there a moment, head bowed, snow collecting on his shoulders. Without thinking, she pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. The air was sharp and clear. The sun warmed nothing, but it made the white around them glow. She crossed to the fence, boots crunching down through drifts. He saw her coming and leaned on the post, rubbing his leg. "You shouldn't be out here. I'm fine." They stood side by side, breath clouding the air. From here, the cabin looked small but strong, the kind of place that could last if someone wanted it to. She glanced at him. "You ever think about leaving? Starting somewhere else?" He squinted toward the hills. "Used to. Thought about Texas, Montana, figured there might be more of something out there." And now he looked at her. "I don't know, this place, it grows on you, or maybe I just got tired of chasing." She nodded. "I know that feeling." The wind tugged lightly at her hair. A crow passed overhead, black against the sky. "I never thought I'd trust a man again." "Not really." He did not move, did not turn. "I'm not asking for that. Not unless you offer it." She looked down at the snow. Her boots were almost buried. She could feel the cold seeping through, but she did not step back. "I'm not ready. That's all right. But I'm not scared anymore." He nodded, quiet. "That's more than most folks ever get." They stood there a while longer. The sun climbed and the snow began to melt in slow drips from the eaves. Somewhere in the trees, water moved beneath ice, whispering of what would come next. That night, they sat close by the fire. Daniel lay curled on a quilt nearby, thumb tucked under his cheek. Margaret leaned against the wall, a mug of warm broth in her hands. Ethan sat on the floor, knees pulled up, coat draped across his lap. She looked at him. "You said you were raised better than how you lived. What did your mother teach you?" He stared into the fire. "She taught me to keep a promise, to speak plain, and to never hit a man who's already down." Margaret let out a breath she had not realized she'd been holding. "She sounds like someone worth remembering." She was. They did not need more than that. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind was soft again. A feeling came into the room then. Not happiness, not quite, but the beginning of peace. The kind that only comes after the worst has passed and you have somehow stayed standing. 2 weeks passed. The snow thinned, then melted back into the earth, leaving behind the slick mud and the scent of thawed grass. The sun lingered a little longer each evening, pale and golden as a candle left burning on a windowsill. Birds returned, not many, but enough to fill the mornings with something that felt like hope. Margaret took to walking the fence line in the afternoons, Daniel trailing behind her with a stick in hand, pretending to guard the land. She taught him how to mend broken wire, how to spot fresh tracks, how to listen for changes in the wind. He was growing steadier, more solid in the world. She watched the weight return to his cheeks, the brightness to his eyes. Ethan kept working. He repaired the sagging barn roof, sanded down the splintered porch rail, hauled stones from the field, and set them in neat rows around the edge of the garden. He never asked her to help, but she did anyway, not out of debt, just because it felt good to work beside someone who did not expect more than what was offered. They spoke more now, about little things, weather, tools, what grew well in the soil and what did not. At night, when Daniel was asleep, they sat by the fire and sometimes said nothing at all, just watched the flames stretch and fade, content in the quiet they shared. One evening, she found a box tucked in the back of the cupboard. Inside were old papers, a few yellowed letters, and a stack of worn photographs. Men on horseback, a woman in a long dress holding a child, a younger Ethan, maybe 16, face thinner, but the same sharp eyes. She did not mean to pry, but when she asked about them, he did not flinch. "That was my sister." He tapped the edge of the photo. "Lena, the only one who stayed kind. She's still alive." "Don't know. She married a soldier, moved west. We lost touch after the war." He paused. "She'd have liked you." Margaret smiled, small and sad. "Not many people do." He met her eyes. Then they weren't looking close enough. The fire shifted. Shadows danced across the floor. That night, she did not ask him to stay in the bed. She did not have to. He lay beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. One hand resting between them on the quilt fingers, just close enough to touch if she reached. But she did not reach. Not yet. Not because she did not want to, but because she wanted it to mean something when she did. The next day, a rider came. He was tall, lean, with a slick mustache and boots too clean for this part of the country. He did not dismount, just waited at the edge of the yard, reins slack in one hand. Ethan stepped out first, wiping his hands on a rag. Margaret stood in the doorway, Daniel behind her, his small hand gripping her skirt. You Ethan Calloway, I am. The man nodded toward the house. Got word there's a woman and child staying here. You take them in. Ethan did not answer right away, just narrowed his eyes. Depends who's asking. Name's Rourke. I work out of Red Creek. Got a man there, claims a woman matching her description ran off with his boy. Wants her returned. Margaret's stomach turned to stone. She stepped out onto the porch, her voice tight. He gave us nothing but hunger and bruises. He doesn't want us. He just wants to own what he broke. Rourke shrugged. Ain't my concern. Just passing the message. Ethan took a slow step forward. You passing it or trying to collect? Rourke smirked. Depends. You planning to make it worth my while not to? The silence that followed was heavy. Then Ethan said calm and sure. You'll turn that horse around and you won't come back. Rourke's hand hovered near his coat. That a threat, Numb? It's a promise. Rourke looked past him toward Margaret. His eyes raked over her, calculating. You'd let her bring trouble to your door. She didn't bring it. It followed her. Big difference. The man stared a moment longer, weighing it. Then he clicked his tongue, turned the horse, and rode off without a word. The dust settled. Ethan let out a breath and turned back toward the house. Margaret was still on the porch, arms folded across her chest, trembling. Not with fear, but with the pressure of too many days spent waiting for the past to catch up. He'll come back. Maybe. She looked him full in the face. You still want us here, even with what's chasing us. He did not hesitate. Yes, still do. And for the first time, she believed him completely. The wind had shifted, not just in the sky, but in the house itself. After Rourke's visit, nothing was said aloud, yet everything felt sharper, more real. Margaret found herself listening for hoofbeats at odd hours, checking the latch on the door twice before bed. Daniel picked up on it too, though he did not speak of it. He just stayed closer to her side, more watchful than before. Ethan did not bring it up again. He went about his work with the same quiet steadiness, but now he kept the rifle loaded near the door. He cleaned it each night slowly, carefully, like a ritual. When Margaret asked if he expected trouble, he just said, Hope not, but I've never seen hope stop a bullet. Still the work went on. The days grew longer. The snow melted into the ground, turning fields to slush, then soil. Margaret cleared the garden beds, her fingers aching with each pull of the weeds. But it helped. The work made sense. Things either grew or they did not. There was no cruelty in that. She began stitching again, old dresses repurposed into shirts for Daniel, worn blankets patched and mended. Her hands remembered more than she thought they would. Some nights she would catch Ethan watching her from across the room, not with hunger or pity, just with a quiet kind of wondering, as though he could not quite believe she was real. One evening while Daniel slept and the fire burned low, Margaret sat near the hearth, her thread looping in and out of the fabric on her lap. Ethan was at the table carving a handle for one of the kitchen knives. She said without looking up, If he comes back, if he tries something. I won't run. Ethan looked at her. You don't have to fight alone. Her fingers paused. That's the part I'm still getting used to. He set down the knife and crossed the room, knelt beside her. His voice was so quiet it almost was not a voice at all. You're not alone, Margaret. Not anymore. She did not speak, just reached for his hand and held it, not as a promise, but as proof. On Sunday morning, Ethan hitched the wagon and took them into town. Red Creek was not much. A single dirt road lined with weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon with crooked shutters, a church with a bell tower that leaned south. But it was people, and Margaret had not seen people in a long time. They stopped first at the store. Ethan bought flour and coffee, a sack of dried beans, a tin of lamp oil. The clerk, a woman with gray hair, pinned tight, watched Margaret with curious eyes but said nothing. Daniel pressed his nose to the glass case where candy sat in neat rows, his breath fogging the surface. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a nickel. Pick one. Daniel's eyes went wide. He pointed to a peppermint stick, red and white striped. Ethan nodded to the clerk and she wrapped it in paper and handed it over. The boy clutched it like treasure. Outside, the street was quiet. A few men stood near the saloon, smoking, their eyes following Margaret as she walked past. She kept her head down, Daniel close to her side. Ethan's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a gesture both protective and subtle. They passed the church just as the doors opened and people began filing out. A man in black stood on the steps, shaking hands, offering words Margaret could not hear. He was older, gray-haired, with a face lined by sun and years. When he saw Ethan, his expression brightened. "Ethan Calloway." "Been a while," Ethan nodded. "Pastor Whitman." The pastor's eyes shifted to Margaret, then to Daniel, taking them in with quiet assessment. "You've got company." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "This is Margaret Brennan and her son Daniel. They're staying with me for a time." The pastor's gaze softened. "Well, you're welcome here anytime, both of you." Margaret nodded, murmuring thanks. The pastor smiled, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of concern or perhaps curiosity. He reached out and ruffled Daniel's hair. "You look after your ma's son." Daniel nodded solemnly. They climbed back into the wagon, and Ethan flicked the reins. As they rolled out of town, Margaret glanced back at the church, at the people still gathered on the steps, talking in small clusters. She wondered what they would say about her, about Ethan, about the woman and child who had appeared from nowhere. That night, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire while Ethan sharpened tools outside. Daniel was asleep in his peppermint stick tucked carefully beneath his pillow. Margaret stared into the flames, her mind turning over the day, the faces she had seen, the way the pastor had looked at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. She heard the door open. Ethan came in smelling of metal and cold air. He hung his coat and crossed to the hearth, settling into the chair beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. People were watching. They always do. Small towns don't have much else for entertainment. She glanced at him. "Does it bother you? Having us here, what people might say?" He met her eyes and his voice was firm. "I stopped caring what people say a long time ago." She wanted to believe that, wanted to believe it was that simple. But she had learned that nothing ever was. The days continued to lengthen. Spring arrived in fits and starts, one day warm enough to shed a coat, the next bitter with wind. Margaret worked the garden, planting seeds Ethan had bought in town. Carrots, beans, squash. She knelt in the dirt, pressing each seed into the soil with a kind of reverence, as though she were planting hope itself. Daniel helped his small hands, muddy, his face serious with concentration. He had begun to speak more, asking questions about everything. Why did the chickens scratch the ground? How did the well stay cold? What made the sky turn pink at sunset? Margaret answered what she could, and when she could not, Ethan would step in, his explanations patient and clear. The boy hung on every word, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. One afternoon, a wagon rolled up the path. Margaret looked up from the garden, her heart quickening. But Ethan stepped out from the barn, his posture relaxed, and she realized he recognized the visitor. A man climbed down from the wagon, older, with a thick beard and a worn hat. He carried a sack over one shoulder. "Calloway," Ethan nodded. "Fletcher." The man glanced toward Margaret, then back at Ethan. "Heard you had company." Ethan's expression did not change. "Word travels fast." Fletcher shrugged. "Just wanted to check in. Make sure everything's square." "It is." Fletcher hesitated, then reached into the sack and pulled out a jar of honey. "Wife sent this. Figured you might need it." Ethan took the bar and something in his face softened. "Tell her I'm grateful." Fletcher nodded, climbed back into the wagon, and left without another word. Margaret watched the dust settle, then looked at Ethan. "A friend close as I've got out here. He owns the land to the south. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly." She nodded, but something in his tone told her there was more. That Fletcher's visit had not been just about honey. It had been about checking, about making sure Ethan had not gotten himself into trouble. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Margaret stood on the porch watching the land stretch out before her. She heard the door open behind her, felt Ethan's presence before he spoke. "You thinking about running?" She turned, surprised. "No." He leaned against the rail, his eyes on the horizon. "I wouldn't blame you if you were. This place, it's not easy. And there's talk in town. I can feel it." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Let them talk." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she had not seen before. Vulnerability, fear even. The fear of losing something he had not realized he wanted until it was already there. "I don't want to lose you." The words hung between them, raw and honest. She reached out her hand, finding his. "You won't," and she meant it. Not because she had all the answers, not because the future was certain, but because for the first time in her life, she had chosen something for herself, and she was not going to let fear take it away. The weeks that followed carried a strange kind of peace, the sort that comes before a storm. Margaret had learned to read the land, Now the way the sky darkened before rain, the way the wind shifted before cold. But she had not yet learned to read men, not fully, and so she did not see what was coming until it was almost too late. Ethan had begun teaching Daniel to ride. Every morning after chores, he would lift the boy onto the mare's back and lead him around the corral, one hand on the bridle, the other hovering near Daniel's leg in case he slipped. The boy's laughter rang out across the yard bright and clear, and Margaret would pause in her work to watch them, something warm and fragile unfolding in her chest. She had not laughed much in the last 3 years, had not allowed herself to. Laughter required safety, and safety had been a luxury she could not afford. But here in this place with this man, she felt the edges of her fear beginning to soften. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Ethan sat on the porch steps mending a bridle. Margaret came out with 2 cups of coffee, handing him one, before settling beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling. Daniel's getting better. He's a natural. Got good balance. She smiled, watching the boy chase fireflies across the yard, his jar clutched in both hands. He's happy here. Ethan glanced at her, his voice quiet. What about you? She considered the question, turning it over like a stone. I think I could be. Could be. She met his eyes. I'm afraid to believe in it. Every time I've believed in something, it's been taken away. He nodded, understanding more than she said. Fear's a hard thing to shake. I still wake up some nights thinking I'm back in the war. Still hear the guns. She had not known he had fought. He had never mentioned it, never wore it like some men did, like a badge to be displayed. How long were you in? 3 years. Signed up when I was 17. Thought it would make me a man. He laughed, bitter and low. Just made me tired. What did you do after came back here? My pa had died while I was gone. Lena had married and left. The house was empty, so I stayed. Didn't know what else to do. She reached over her hand, finding his knee, a small gesture but deliberate. He covered her hand with his own, his palm rough and warm. I'm glad you stayed. He looked at her, then really looked, and she felt something shift between them. Not just attraction, not just gratitude. Something deeper. Something that terrified her and drew her in all at once. Margaret, his voice was barely a whisper, I need you to know something. If your husband comes, if he tries to take you, I won't let him. She swallowed hard. You don't owe me that. It's not about owing. It's about doing what's right. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he would stand between her and the man who had broken her more times than she could count. But trust was a muscle she had not used in so long, and it ached when she tried. The next Sunday they went to church. Margaret had resisted at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being seen, of facing the stares and whispers. But Ethan had insisted gently that it would be good for Daniel to be around other children. And so she had relented. The church was packed, families crowding into pews, the air thick with the smell of lye soap and wool. Pastor Whitman stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying over the congregation with practiced ease. Margaret sat between Ethan and Daniel, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar. The sermon was about forgiveness, about letting go of the past and embracing the grace of new beginnings. Margaret listened, but the words felt hollow. Forgiveness was for people who had not spent 3 years walking on eggshells waiting for the next blow. Forgiveness was a luxury she had not yet earned. After the service, people lingered outside, talking in clusters. A few women approached Margaret, their smiles tight and polite. They asked where she was from, how she knew Ethan, how long she planned to stay. She answered carefully, offering as little as possible, but she could feel their judgment, sharp and cold as winter wind. One woman, younger than the rest, with red hair pinned beneath a blue bonnet, leaned in close. You're the one staying at the Calloway place, aren't you? Margaret nodded. Must be nice, having a roof over your head. Some women aren't so lucky. There was something in her tone, something barbed. Margaret's jaw tightened. I work for my keep. The woman's smile did not reach her eyes. I'm sure you do. Before Margaret could respond, Ethan appeared at her side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. We should head back. Margaret nodded, relief flooding through her. They collected Daniel, who had been playing with a group of boys near the fence, and climbed into the wagon. As they rolled away from the church, Margaret glanced back at the red-haired woman who stood watching them, her arms crossed over her chest. Who was that? Ethan's jaw tightened. Clara Matthews. Her family owns the feed store. She's got a sharp tongue and not much else to do with it. Margaret said nothing, but she felt the sting of the woman's words, the implication hanging heavy in the air. She knew what people thought. A woman alone with a man who was not her husband. A woman with no ring on her finger and no explanation for how she had ended up here. It did not matter that she was trying to survive. It did not matter that Ethan had offered shelter without expectation. People would see what they wanted to see. That night after Daniel was asleep, Margaret sat by the fire, her hands idle in her lap. Ethan sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood, the knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "You're quiet." She looked up. "I'm thinking about what people see when they look at me." He set down the knife, his expression serious. "What do they see?" She hesitated, then spoke, her voice low. "A woman with no husband, living with a man who's not her family. They think they know what that means. And what do you think it means?" She met his eyes. "I think it means I'm trying to survive. But I don't know if that's enough for them." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I don't care what they think. And you shouldn't either. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're whispering about." His face hardened. "You think I don't hear it? You think I don't know what they're saying? That I'm a fool for taking you in? That you're using me? That I'm too soft or too stupid to see it?" She flinched. "I didn't know. Now you do." He picked up the knife again, but his hands were tense, the movements jerky. "I don't regret it, any of it. And I'll be damned if I let their small minds decide how we live." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that their opinions did not matter. But she had learned that whispers had a way of becoming shouts, and shouts had a way of becoming fists. The following week, a letter arrived. Ethan brought it back from town, the envelope worn and creased, the ink smudged. It was addressed to him, but when he opened it, his face went pale. He handed it to her without a word. The letter was short, written in a cramped, uneven hand. "Ethan Calloway, I know you have my wife and boy. I want them back. I'll be coming for them, and you can make this easy or you can make it hard. Either way, they're mine by law. Don't make me involve the authorities. James Brennan." Margaret's hands trembled as she read. The words blurred her vision, narrowing. She had known this was coming, had felt it in her bones. But seeing it written out, seeing his name, brought it all back. The fear, the helplessness, the certainty that no matter how far she ran, he would always find her. Ethan took the letter from her, his jaw set. "He's not taking you." His voice was steel. "You don't understand. He has the law on his side. I'm his wife. Daniel is his son. There's nothing we can do. There's always something." She shook her head, tears threatening. "I won't let you get hurt because of me. Maybe it's better if I just go. If I take Daniel and leave before he gets here." Ethan's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Not hard, just firm enough to hold her in place. Don't even think it." She looked at him, her eyes wet. Why? Why are you doing this? Because you deserve better. Because Daniel deserves better. Because I... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. But she heard what he did not say. She heard it in the silence, in the way his hand trembled against her skin. She pulled away, her voice breaking. "I can't ask this of you. You're not asking. I'm offering." They stood there, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. Finally, Ethan stepped back, his expression hard. "We have time. He won't get here for at least a few days. Maybe a week. We'll figure something out." But Margaret was not sure there was anything to figure out. The law was clear. A woman belonged to her husband. A child belonged to his father. Running had only ever been a temporary solution. Sooner or later, James would catch up. And when he did, there would be no escaping. That night, she lay awake beside Daniel, listening to his soft breathing, memorizing the sound of it. She thought about the life they could have had here, the garden she had planted, the fence Daniel had helped mend, the mornings waking to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. It had been a dream, brief and fragile, and now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. She heard the door open, soft and careful. Ethan crossed the room, his footsteps nearly silent. He knelt beside the bed, his face barely visible in the dim light. "I can't sleep. Neither can I." He reached out his hand, finding hers in the dark. "We'll get through this." She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty, but she had been through too much to trust in happy endings. "I'm scared. I know." His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a small comfort in the darkness. But you're not alone. Not anymore. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a long time they stayed like that. Hands clasped the weight of what was coming, pressing down on them both. The days passed in a blur. Ethan worked faster, harder, as though preparing for a siege. He reinforced the barn door, checked the rifle twice a day, rode into town to talk to Pastor Whitman, though he did not tell Margaret what was said. She watched him move through the hours with grim determination, and she hated that she had brought this to his door. Daniel sensed the change. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped asking questions, stopped chasing fireflies. At night, he would curl against her, his small body tense, and she would stroke his hair and whisper promises she did not know if she could keep. On the 5th day after the letter arrived, a wagon rolled up the path. Margaret's heart seized. But it was not James. It was Fletcher, the neighbor who had brought honey weeks before. He climbed down, his face grave. Ethan. Fletcher. They stood in the yard speaking in low voices. Margaret watched from the porch, unable to hear, but able to read the tension in their postures. After a few minutes, Fletcher nodded, clapped Ethan on the shoulder, and left. Ethan came up the steps, his expression unreadable. What did he say? He said James is in town, asking around, showing people a photograph of you. Margaret's breath caught. How long do we have? A day? Maybe 2. She sank into the chair, her legs giving out. What are we going to do? Ethan crouched in front of her, his hands on her knees. Listen to me. When he comes, you stay inside with Daniel. You lock the door and you don't come out until I tell you. Understand? She nodded, though her mind was screaming. He's going to kill you. Ethan's smile was grim. He's going to try him. That night they did not sleep. Ethan sat by the door, the rifle across his lap. Margaret sat by the fire, her hands working a piece of thread, though she was not sewing anything. Just moving. Just trying to keep the fear at bay. Daniel slept fitfully, his face pale in the firelight. She watched him memorizing every line, every curve. If James took them back, she did not know what would happen. She did not know if she could survive another 3 years. And she did not know if Daniel would survive at all. Just before dawn, Ethan spoke, his voice low. If something happens to me, if this goes bad, you take Daniel and you run. Fletcher will help you. He knows. She looked at him, her throat tight. I'm not leaving you. You have to. For Daniel. She wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she was tired of running, tired of losing everything she tried to hold on to. But she knew he was right. Daniel came first. He always had. I'm sorry. Ethan turned, his eyes meeting hers. For what? For all of it. For bringing this into your life. He stood crossing to her and pulled her to her feet. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she had not realized were falling. Don't apologize for surviving. And then he kissed her. Soft at first, then deeper, like he was trying to memorize the shape of her, the taste. She kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in the world. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. I love you, Margaret. I need you to know that. Her breath hitched. I love you too. It was the first time she had said it, the first time she had allowed herself to feel it. And now, with everything falling apart, it felt like the cruelest joke. They came at noon, 3 men on horseback. James Brennan rode in front, his face hard and weathered, his eyes cold. He was taller than Margaret remembered, broader, his beard streaked with gray. Beside him rode 2 other men, younger, rougher, the kind hired for muscle. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the rifle in his hands but not yet raised. Margaret stood just inside the door, Daniel pressed against her side, his small hand gripping her skirt. James dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the yard before settling on Ethan. You Calloway, I am. James nodded, his expression calm, almost pleasant. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. I have a woman and a boy under my protection. They're free to leave if they choose, but they don't choose you. James's smile was thin. She's my wife. The boy's my son. Law says they come home with me. The law doesn't say anything about a woman running from a man who beats her. James's smile faded. That's a lie. She's always been dramatic, prone to exaggeration. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud. You broke my ribs twice. You gave Daniel a scar across his back that will never heal. Don't stand there and call me a liar. James's eyes flicked to her, something dark and ugly moving behind them. Get over here, Margaret. Now, no. His jaw tightened. I'm not asking, and I'm not going. He took a step forward, and Ethan raised the rifle, the barrel pointed directly at James's chest. That's far enough. James stopped, his hands spreading in a gesture of false calm. You really want to do this? You really want to put a bullet in me over a woman you barely know? Ethan's voice did not waver. I'd do it to protect anyone from a man like you. But yes, especially for her. James's face twisted, rage breaking through the mask of civility. You think you're a hero? You think she won't do the same thing to you that she did to me? She's a whore and a liar, and you're a fool for believing her. Margaret flinched, the words striking deep, but Ethan did not move. Leave. Now. And don't come back. James stared at him for a long moment, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then he turned to the men beside him. Get her. The two men dismounted, moving toward the porch. Ethan's finger moved to the trigger. Don't. His voice was ice. I will shoot. One of the men hesitated, but the other kept coming, his hand reaching for Margaret. Ethan fired. The shot cracked through the air, deafening. The bullet hit the ground at the man's feet, dirt spraying up. He froze. Next one goes through your chest. James's face went red. You'll hang for this. Ethan's smile was cold. Then I'll die knowing I did something that mattered. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel Daniel trembling against her. Then slowly James climbed back onto his horse. This isn't over. It is unless you want it to end here. James stared at him, fury and something close to fear warring in his eyes. Then he turned his horse and rode off, the two men following. They disappeared over the ridge, and for a long time no one moved. Finally, Ethan lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her legs barely holding her. She reached for him, and he pulled her close, his arms tight around her. It's over. She wanted to believe him, but she knew men like James, knew they did not give up easily. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. That night, Ethan sat at the table writing a letter. Margaret watched him, exhaustion settling into her bones. What are you writing? A statement? About what happened here? About what James did to you? I'm going to take it to Pastor Whitman and the sheriff tomorrow. Get it on record. She shook her head. They won't believe me. They might, especially with Fletcher as a witness. And if they don't, at least there's something written down. Something that says you tried. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired, too drained. She simply nodded and turned away. Her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Later, as they lay in bed, Daniel asleep between them, Ethan's hand found hers in the dark. We'll figure this out. She did not answer, just held his hand and prayed he was right. But deep down she knew. Men like James did not lose. They just waited. And when they came back harder. The morning came gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow, but delivered nothing. Ethan left before dawn, the letter folded in his coat pocket, his face set with determination. Margaret watched him ride out, Daniel still asleep beside her, and felt the familiar weight of dread settle in her chest. She rose and went through the motions, fed the fire, boiled water, swept the floor. But her hands moved without thought, her mind elsewhere. She kept seeing James's face, the rage barely contained beneath that false calm. She knew him well enough to know he would not simply walk away. He would regroup, find another approach, come back when she least expected it. Daniel woke slowly, his eyes still puffy from sleep. He climbed out of bed and came to stand beside her at the stove, his small hand slipping into hers. Is Pa coming back? She flinched at the word, as if that man had ever been a father to anyone. I don't know. Are we safe here? She knelt down, bringing herself to his level. Ethan will keep us safe, and so will I. The boy nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He had learned too young that adults made promises they could not keep. Ethan returned just before noon, his face drawn. He dismounted and came inside, shaking the cold from his shoulders. Margaret handed him coffee, and he took it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the cup. What did they say? Sheriff listened, took the letter, said he'd look into it. His tone suggested he did not believe a word of it. But he also said that without proof, without witnesses who saw the abuse, it's just your word against James's. And James has a marriage certificate. He has legal claim. Margaret's stomach twisted. So he can just take us. Ethan set down the cup, his jaw tight. Not if I have anything to say about it. You can't fight the law. Watch me. She wanted to believe in his conviction, in his certainty. But she had seen what happened to people who fought the law. They lost. Always. Pastor Whitman wants to talk to you. She looked up sharply. Why, he thinks he might be able to help. Something about church sanctuary. I don't know all the details, but he said to come by tomorrow. Margaret nodded, though she did not hold much hope. The church had never helped women like her before. Why would it start now? That evening, as they sat by the fire, Daniel between them playing with wooden blocks Ethan had carved, a knock came at the door. Sharp, insistent. Ethan rose immediately, his hand going to the rifle. Margaret pulled Daniel close. Who is it? A woman's voice muffled through the wood. It's Clara Matthews from the feed store. I need to speak with you. Ethan glanced at Margaret, who shook her head, but he opened the door anyway, just a crack. Clara stood on the porch, her red hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale in the fading light. What do you want? Can I come in? Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside. Clara entered, her eyes darting around the cabin before settling on Margaret. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. I came to apologize. Margaret blinked, stunned. For what I said at church, for judging you without knowing your story. Why now? Clara's hands twisted together. Because James Brennan came into the store today. Drunk, angry. He told everyone who would listen that his wife was a runaway whore and that the man harboring her was going to hang. She paused, her voice dropping. My husband was in the back. He heard it all. And then James said something else. About how he was going to make sure you learned your place. That he'd break you properly this time. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. And then my husband did something I've never seen him do. He threw James out. Told him he wasn't welcome in our store. Told him that any man who talks about his wife that way isn't worth the dirt on his boots. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I realized I'd been wrong about you. And I wanted you to know that not everyone in town thinks like I did. Margaret did not know what to say. The apology felt genuine, but trust was not something she could afford easily. Thank you, Clara nodded, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. There are others who feel the same. Women who've seen what men like James can do. If you need help, you're not as alone as you think. Then she was gone, disappearing into the dusk. Ethan closed the door and looked at Margaret. Maybe things are changing. She wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that Clara's words meant something. But hope was a dangerous thing, and she had learned to be careful with it. The next day they went to see Pastor Whitman. The church was empty, the pews shadowed and quiet. The pastor met them at the door, his face kind but serious. He led them to a small room at the back where a fire burned low in a stone hearth. Sit, please. They did. Daniel perched on Margaret's lap, his eyes wide as he looked around the room. The pastor settled into a chair across from them, his hands folded. I've been thinking about your situation, and I've been doing some research. He pulled out a worn book, its pages yellowed with age. There's a legal concept called divorce on the grounds of cruelty. It's rare, it's difficult, but it's possible. Margaret's breath caught. I can't afford a lawyer. I know, but there are ways. If we can get testimony from witnesses, from people who've seen James's temper, who can speak to his character. And if we can show that you feared for your life and the life of your child, a judge might grant a dissolution of marriage. It was the first real hope she had felt in days, but it was fragile, easily crushed. How long would it take? Months, maybe longer. Ethan leaned forward, and in the meantime, James has every legal right to take her. Unless, the pastor paused, choosing his words carefully, unless she's under the protection of the church. We have an old tradition of sanctuary. It's not legally binding anymore, but it carries weight. If Margaret and Daniel were to stay here in the church, it would make it harder for James to act, at least publicly. Margaret shook her head. I can't live in a church, not love. Just stay during the day, when Ethan's not home, when you're most vulnerable. It was not a solution, just a delay. But delays bought time, and time was all they had. I'll do it. Ethan's hand found hers, squeezing gently. The pastor nodded. Good. We'll start tomorrow. As they left the church, the sky had begun to darken, clouds rolling in from the west. Snow was coming, Ethan said, a bad storm. They would need to stock up, prepare for being snowed in. On the ride back, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of resolve. She had spent 3 years being afraid, 3 years running, and she was tired of it. Tired of letting James dictate her life. If this was going to be a fight, then she would fight. Not just for herself, but for Daniel. For the life they deserved. That night, a letter arrived. Not from James this time, but addressed to Ethan in a hand he recognized immediately. His face went pale as he opened it, and Margaret watched as he read, his eyes moving quickly across the page. What is it? It's from my sister, Lena. Margaret's heart skipped. What does she say? He looked up, his expression unreadable. She's in Wyoming. She's been looking for me for 2 years. She says she's remarried to a good man this time. They have land, a house. She wants me to come. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Are you going to go? He folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. I don't know, she nodded, though the words felt like a knife. Of course he would go. Why would he stay here in this place with her problems weighing him down? He had a chance at something better. A family, a fresh start. He would be a fool not to take it. You should go. Her voice was steady even as her heart broke. You should be with your family. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her chest ache. You're my family. The words hung between them, fragile and true. She wanted to believe them, wanted to hold on to them, but she had learned that wanting something did not make it real. Daniel needs stability. He needs more than what I can give him here. Ethan stood crossing to her, his hands cupping her face. Stop. Stop pushing me away. I'm trying to give you an out. I don't want an out. I want you. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. You say that now, but when James comes back, when the law sides with him, when everything falls apart, you'll regret it. His voice was fierce. The only thing I'll regret is not fighting hard enough to keep you. And then he kissed her, desperate and raw, and she kissed him back, pouring everything she could not say into that single moment. When they pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll figure this out, together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in that promise. But the world had taught her that promises were fragile things, easily broken by the weight of reality. The storm hit 2 days later. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the land in white. The wind howled, shaking the cabin walls, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. They were trapped, the three of them huddled around the fire, rationing wood and food. Daniel grew restless, cooped up inside with nothing to do. Ethan carved him small animals out of scraps of wood. A horse, a deer, a bird with wings spread wide. The boy played with them for hours, creating stories, battles, adventures. Margaret watched mending clothes and felt a pang of something bittersweet. This was what childhood should have been for him. Safe, warm, full of imagination instead of fear. On the third day of the storm, the wind finally died. The snow stopped falling and the sun broke through the clouds, turning the world into a blinding white expanse. Ethan bundled up and went out to check on the animals, to dig paths through the drifts. Margaret stood at the window, watching him work, his breath clouding the air. Daniel came to stand beside her. Ma, are we going to stay here forever? She looked down at him. Would you want to? He nodded. I like it here. Ethan's nice. And the chickens are funny. She smiled, ruffling his hair. We'll see. But even as she said it, she knew the answer was not up to them. It was up to James, up to the law, up to forces beyond their control. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan spoke quietly. I've been thinking about Lena's letter. Margaret's stomach tightened. And I think we should consider it. Not me going alone, all of us. She looked at him confused. What do you mean Wyoming's far enough that James would have a hard time following? And Lena says there's work. Land. We could start over, properly. Margaret shook her head. I can't ask you to uproot your life for me. You're not asking, I'm offering. But your land, your home, it's just land, just a house. You and Daniel, you're more than that. She felt tears prick her eyes. What if it doesn't work? What if James finds us anyway? Then we'll deal with it. But at least we'll have tried. She wanted to say yes. Wanted to leap at this chance for a fresh start. But something held her back. Fear, maybe. Or the bone-deep certainty that running never solved anything. It just delayed the inevitable. Let me think about it. He nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Take your time. But time was a luxury they did not have. She knew that, and deep down so did he. A week after the storm cleared, Fletcher came by again. His face was grim, and Margaret knew before he even spoke that the news was bad. James is back. He's got papers this time, from a judge in Kansas. Says Margaret is legally obligated to return. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind of papers? A writ of replevin. Basically says she's his property, and he has the right to reclaim her. Margaret felt the room tilt. Property. That was all she was to him, all she had ever been. There's more. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. He's bringing the sheriff with him tomorrow, and a federal marshal. They're going to enforce the writ. Ethan slammed his fist on the table. That's insane. That's the law. Margaret stood, her legs shaking. Then I'll go. I won't let you get arrested because of me. Ethan turned to her, his eyes blazing. Like hell you will. What choice do we have? We run, tonight. We take the horses and we head for Wyoming. Get there before they can catch us. Fletcher shook his head. They'll come after you. You'll be fugitives. Then we'll be fugitives. Margaret looked between the two men, her heart pounding. This was it. The moment everything came to a head. She could go back to James, let him destroy her slowly, or she could run and risk destroying Ethan in the process. Neither option felt like winning. Fletcher left promising to do what he could to delay the marshal to buy them time. But they all knew it was only a matter of hours. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She lay beside Daniel, listening to his soft breathing, memorizing the sound. Ethan sat by the door, the rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Just before dawn, she rose and went to him. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of everything pressing down on him. She knelt beside him. I'm sorry. His hand found hers. Don't be. I should never have stayed. Should never have let you get involved. I'm glad you did. His voice was fierce. These past few months, they've been the best of my life. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that as the sky slowly lightened the dawn, breaking over the frozen land. When the sun rose, they made their decision. They would not run. They would not hide. They would face whatever came together. And if the law tried to take her, Ethan would stand in the way, even if it cost him everything. At mid-morning, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. Margaret's heart lurched. This was it. She pulled Daniel close, her arms tight around him, and waited. The door opened and Ethan stepped out onto the porch. Margaret moved to the window, watching as four men dismounted. James, the sheriff, a heavy-set man with a badge pinned to his coat. A federal marshal, tall and stone-faced. And another man she did not recognize, dressed in a suit, carrying a leather satchel. The marshal spoke first, his voice carrying across the yard. Ethan Calloway. That's me. I'm Federal Marshal Coughlin. I'm here to enforce a writ of replevin regarding one Margaret Brennan and her minor child, Daniel Brennan. He held up a paper official-looking, sealed with wax. You are ordered to release them into the custody of James Brennan immediately. Ethan's voice was steady. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested for obstruction of justice and harboring a fugitive. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, Daniel clinging to her skirt. Every eye turned to her. I'll go. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. I won't let Ethan be arrested because of me. James's smile was cold and triumphant. Smart girl, finally learning your place. Ethan moved in front of her, blocking James's view. She's not going anywhere. The marshal's hand moved to his pistol. Don't make this harder than it has to be. And then the man in the suit stepped forward. He was older, with gray hair and sharp eyes. He pulled a paper from his satchel and handed it to the marshal. Marshal Coughlin, I'm Attorney Harold Finch, representing Mrs. Brennan. This is a petition for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty filed this morning with the territorial court. The marshal frowned, scanning the paper. This doesn't invalidate the writ. No, but it does complicate matters. The court will need to determine custody of the child pending the divorce proceedings. Until that determination is made, removing the child from his current residence could be seen as kidnapping. James's face went red. That's my son. Finch turned to him, his expression cool. And according to sworn testimony from 3 witnesses, you've beaten that boy so badly, he still carries the scars. Do you really want to argue custody in front of a judge? James lunged forward, but the sheriff stepped between them, his hand on James's chest. Easy now. The marshal looked between the papers, then at Margaret, then at James. Finally, he folded the writ and tucked it into his coat. This is above my pay grade. The court will have to sort it out. He turned to James. You'll get your day in court. But for now, the woman and child stay put. James's fury was palpable, his fists clenched, his face twisted with rage. But he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. He spat at Ethan's feet, then climbed back onto his horse. This isn't over. No, but it's not your call anymore. The men rode off, and Margaret felt her knees buckle. Ethan caught her holding her upright as the world spun. The lawyer Finch approached, his face kind. Pastor Whitman sent me. He's been coordinating with some of the women in town. They've agreed to testify on your behalf. Margaret could barely process the words. Why? Because they've seen what men like your husband do, and they're tired of staying silent. Tears streamed down her face, and she could not tell if they were from relief or disbelief. Ethan held her close, his voice rough. It's going to be all right. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, testimonies, and waiting. Clara Matthews testified. So did Fletcher. So did 3 other women from town who had seen James's temper firsthand. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Margaret testified too, her voice shaking as she recounted the years of abuse, the nights spent hiding the fear that had become her constant companion. Daniel was not required to testify, but the scars on his back were entered as evidence, and the courtroom went silent when the photographs were shown. James's lawyer argued that Margaret was exaggerating, that discipline was a husband's right. But the judge cut him off, his voice sharp. A man who beats his wife and child has no rights in my courtroom. 3 months later, the divorce was granted. Full custody of Daniel went to Margaret. James was ordered to stay at least 100 miles away or face arrest. When the judge's gavel fell, Margaret felt something inside her break open, not with sadness, but with relief so profound she could barely breathe. She turned to Ethan, who had sat beside her through every hearing, every deposition, and he pulled her into his arms. It's over. It's really over. She nodded against his chest, tears soaking his shirt. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining bright and warm. Spring had arrived while they had been fighting, and the world had come back to life. Daniel ran ahead, laughing free in a way he had never been before. Ethan took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. What do you want to do now? She looked at him. This man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return. I want to go home. He smiled. Then let's go home. And they did. Back to the ranch where the garden was beginning to sprout, where the chickens clucked in the yard, where the cabin stood small and strong against the vast prairie. It was not much, but it was theirs. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned gold, Ethan found Margaret on the porch. He sat beside her, and for a long time they simply watched the land stretch out before them. I've been thinking about Lena's letter. She looked at him. About going to Wyoming, about writing back, telling her I found something here, I don't want to leave. She smiled, her heart full. You should still tell her you're happy, that you have family now. I will. He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it, revealing a simple silver band inside. I know it's not much, and I know we've been through hell to get here. But Margaret Brennan, would you marry me? She stared at the ring, then at him, and felt tears well up again. But these were different tears. These were the kind that came from joy. Yes, the word came out as a whisper, but it carried all the weight of everything she felt. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They married a month later in the same church where Pastor Whitman had offered them sanctuary. The ceremony was small, just Fletcher and his wife, Clara Matthews, and her husband, and a handful of others from town who had stood by them. Daniel stood beside Margaret, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, his face solemn with the importance of the occasion. When the pastor pronounced them, husband and wife, Ethan kissed her gently, and the small congregation erupted in applause. Margaret felt something she had not felt in years. She felt whole. The first year of their marriage passed like water through cupped hands, too fast, too precious to hold. Summer came and turned the prairie gold. The garden flourished under Margaret's care, rows of beans and squash and carrots pushing up through the earth. Daniel grew taller, his voice beginning to deepen, though he was still just a boy playing at being a man. Ethan worked the land with renewed purpose, fixing the barn properly, expanding the corral, talking about bringing in cattle come spring. At night, they would sit on the porch together, his arm around her shoulders, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. These were the moments Margaret treasured most, the quiet ones, the ordinary ones, the kind she had never imagined she would have. But peace she was learning was not a permanent state. It was something you fought for daily, something you protected against the inevitable erosion of time and circumstance. The first crack came in October. Fletcher rode up to the house, his face grave. Margaret was in the garden pulling up the last of the summer vegetables before the frost came. She saw him arrive, saw the way he dismounted slowly, and her stomach tightened. Ethan came out from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for her to hear, but she could read the tension in Ethan's shoulders the way Fletcher kept glancing toward the house. When Fletcher left, Ethan stood alone in the yard for a long moment before walking over to her. She straightened dirt on her hands, a carrot dangling from her grip. "What is it? James is dead." The words hung in the air, stark and final. Margaret felt something inside her shift, but it was not grief. It was something more complicated. Relief mixed with a strange hollowness, as though a part of her story had been ripped away before she was ready. "How knife fight in a saloon in Kansas." "Over a card game," Fletcher said. She set down the carrot, her hands trembling. "When 2 weeks ago, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his eyes moving between them." "What's wrong?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Ethan crossed to the boy kneeling down. "Your father died, Daniel." "I'm sorry." The boy's face went blank. Not sad, not relieved, just an empty. He nodded once as though confirming something he had always known, then turned and went back inside. Margaret moved to follow, but Ethan caught her arm. "Give him a minute." She nodded, though every instinct screamed to go to her son. They stood together in the garden, the October wind tugging at their clothes, and she realized that this should have felt like closure. But it did not. It felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet, leaving her unsure where to stand. That night, Daniel refused to eat. He sat on the bed, his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the wall. Margaret sat beside him, her hand on his back. "Talk to me," he shook his head. "It's all right to feel something, even if it's confusing." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "I'm glad he's dead. Does that make me bad?" Her throat tightened. "No, baby. It makes you human." He leaned into her, and she held him while he cried. Not for the man who had hurt them, but for the father he should have had. The one who never existed. The weeks that followed were strange. Margaret found herself thinking about James more than she had in months. Not with longing, but with a kind of detached curiosity. What had made him that way? Had he always been cruel, or had something broken him? She would never know now. The answers had died with him. Ethan gave her space, but she could feel his concern the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking. One evening, as they prepared for bed, he finally spoke. "You're different." She looked at him. "How quieter. Like you're carrying something heavy." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap. "I thought I'd feel free when he died, but I don't. I just feel empty." He sat beside her, his hand covering hers. "You spent 3 years afraid of him, and then another year fighting him. That doesn't just disappear because he's gone. I know, but I wish it did." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Give it time." She nodded, though she was not sure time would be enough. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that piled high against the cabin walls. They were snowed in for days at a time, the three of them huddled around the fire, reading old books, playing cards, telling stories. Daniel began to come back to himself, the shadow lifting slowly from his eyes. One night, as the wind howled outside, Ethan pulled out Lena's letter again. He had written back months ago, telling her about Margaret, about the marriage, about how his life had changed. But he had not heard back, and Margaret could see the worry creeping into his face. Maybe the letter never reached her. Maybe he folded it carefully, tucking it back into the drawer. Or maybe she's angry that I didn't come when she asked. If she loves you, she'll understand. He nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was thicker, the envelope embossed with an address in Wyoming. Ethan's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were 2 letters. One from Lena, the other from a man named Samuel, her husband. Ethan read Lena's letter first, his eyes moving quickly across the page. When he finished, he looked up, his face pale. "What does it say?" She's sick. Consumption. She's been sick for months. Samuel says she doesn't have much time. Margaret's heart clenched. You have to go. He looked at her anguish written across his face. I can't leave you. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. She's your sister, your only family. You have to go. What about the ranch? Fletcher can check in. We'll manage. What about you? Her smile was sad. I'm not going anywhere. He pulled her close, his voice rough. Come with me, you and Daniel. We'll all go. She wanted to say yes, wanted to see Wyoming, wanted to meet the woman who had meant so much to him. But the ranch needed tending, and Daniel had school now, and the thought of another long journey and another upheaval made her weary. You need to do this alone, to say goodbye properly. He searched her face and she saw the conflict there. But finally he nodded. 2 days later, he left. Margaret and Daniel stood on the porch watching him ride away, his saddlebags packed with food and warm clothes. He looked back once, raising his hand, and then he was gone, disappearing over the ridge. The house felt empty without him. Margaret threw herself into work, cleaning obsessively, mending every piece of clothing they owned, baking bread they did not need. Daniel helped where he could, but he was quieter now, more withdrawn. At night, they would sit by the fire, and she would tell him stories about his future, about the man he would become. You're going to be better than him. Better than James, I know. His voice was small but certain. Ethan showed me how. She smiled, her heart aching with love for this boy who had been through so much and still managed to find hope. Ethan was gone for 6 weeks. When he returned, it was late at night, snow falling thick and soft. Margaret woke to the sound of the door opening, and she was on her feet instantly, the rifle in her hands before she realized it was him. He stood in the doorway, snow dusting his coat, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. She set down the rifle and went to him, and he collapsed into her arms, sobbing. She's gone. Margaret held him, feeling his body shake with the force of his grief. She did not speak, did not offer platitudes, just held him while he broke the way he had held her so many times before. Later, after he had warmed by the fire and eaten, he told her about Lena, about how she had been so thin, so frail, but still smiling when she saw him, about how they had talked for hours, catching up on years lost, about how she had held his hand at the end and told him she was proud of the man he had become. She wanted to meet you, to meet Daniel. She said she wished she could have seen the life you built together. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I wish I could have met her too. He nodded, then pulled a small wooden box from his coat pocket. She left this for you. Inside was a silver locket, delicate and old. Margaret opened it to find 2 photographs, one of Lena as a young woman, beautiful and strong, the other of a man she did not recognize. That's our father. Before the drink took him. Ethan's voice was quiet. She wanted you to have it, said you were the sister she never got to keep. Margaret closed the locket, her fingers trembling. She had never had a sister, never had family beyond Daniel. And now, through Ethan, she had been given this gift, this connection to someone she would never meet, but who had thought of her at the end. I'll treasure it. He pulled her close and they sat together in the firelight, 2 people bound by loss and love, trying to make sense of a world that gave and took in equal measure. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in fits and starts, the ground muddy and treacherous. But with it came new life. The garden began to sprout. The chickens laid more eggs. And Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch, the sun setting in shades of pink and gold. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, before a smile broke across his face. Are you sure? She nodded, her own smile trembling. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. We're going to have a baby. She nodded, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. A family. Daniel was thrilled when they told him. He asked endless questions about whether it would be a brother or a sister, what they would name it, whether he could teach it to ride. His excitement was infectious, and Margaret found herself caught up in it, imagining a future she had never dared to hope for. But as the months passed and her belly grew, old fears crept back in. What if something went wrong? What if she was not a good enough mother? What if the baby inherited James's cruelty? Ethan would find her sometimes standing at the window, her hand on her stomach, tears streaming down her face. He would pull her close, his voice steady. You're going to be a wonderful mother, you already are. But what if I'm not? Then we'll figure it out. Together, she clung to those words, to the certainty in his voice, and tried to believe. The baby came in November on a cold, clear night when the stars burned bright overhead. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Margaret thought she might not survive it. But the midwife from town, a sturdy woman named Ruth, talked her through it, her voice calm and firm. When the baby finally arrived, wailing and red-faced, Ruth placed her in Margaret's arms. A girl, healthy and strong. Margaret looked down at her daughter, this tiny, perfect creature, and felt something inside her heal. All the fear, all the doubt melted away in the face of this new life. She was not James's child. She was theirs. Margaret and Ethan's. A symbol of everything they had fought for. Ethan came in, Daniel close behind, and they crowded around the bed, staring in awe at the baby. What should we name her? Margaret looked up at Ethan, then back at the baby. Lena. Her name is Lena. His face crumpled, and he leaned down, kissing Margaret's forehead, then the baby's. Perfect. It's perfect. The first year of Lena's life was chaos. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, the constant worry that something would go wrong. But it was also joy, watching her first smile, hearing her first laugh, seeing Daniel's fierce protectiveness as he hovered over his baby sister. Margaret found herself changed by motherhood in ways she had not expected. She was softer now, more patient, but also fiercer. She would fight anyone who threatened her children, would burn the world down to keep them safe. Ethan watched her with something like awe, as though he could not quite believe she was real. At night, after the children were asleep, they would lie together, her head on his chest, his hand tracing lazy circles on her back. I love you. He said it often like a prayer. I love you too. And she meant it, with everything she had. Lena was 3 years old, toddling around the yard with fearless abandon when the knock came at the door. It was early spring, the ground still soft from snowmelt, the air carrying the promise of warmth. Margaret opened the door to find a young woman standing on the porch, no older than 20, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed strangely familiar. Can I help you? The woman's hands twisted together nervously. I'm looking for Daniel Brennan. Is this the right place? Margaret's heart seized. The name Brennan felt like a curse, something from a life she had worked so hard to leave behind. Who's asking? The woman hesitated. My name is Catherine. Catherine Brennan. I'm his sister. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sister. James had never mentioned another child, never mentioned a first wife. But looking at this woman, at the shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, Margaret saw echoes of James. And something else. Something softer. Come inside. Catherine sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Margaret had poured. Daniel, now 11 years old and tall for his age, stood in the doorway, watching her with wary curiosity. Ethan stood behind Margaret, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Catherine's story spilled out slowly, haltingly. Her mother had married James when she was 17. He had been different then, or so her mother claimed. Charming, kind. But after Catherine was born, the mask had slipped. The violence had started. Her mother had fled when Catherine was 3, taking her daughter and disappearing. I grew up not knowing I had a brother. My mother never told me. She was too afraid James would find us if we started asking questions. Catherine's voice cracked. But she died last year. Cancer. Before she passed, she told me everything. About James, about you and Daniel, about how you'd escaped. She looked at Daniel, tears streaming down her face. I've been searching for 6 months. I just needed to know you were all right. Daniel crossed the room slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal. He stopped in front of Catherine, studying her face. You're really my sister, half-sister. But yes, a smile broke across his face, tentative but real. I always wanted a sibling. Besides Lena, I mean. Catherine let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry, and Daniel, with the unself-conscious compassion of a child who had known suffering, wrapped his arms around her. Over the following weeks, Catherine stayed with them. She slept in the small guest room Ethan had added to the house 2 years prior, and she fell easily into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Margaret with the cooking and mending, played with Lena, and spent hours talking with Daniel, the two of them piecing together their separate histories. But Catherine had brought more than just stories. One evening after the children were in bed, she pulled out a stack of papers. There's something you need to know. Before my mother died, she hired a lawyer to look into James's estate. She wanted to make sure he couldn't hurt us anymore, even after death. She spread the papers across the table. James had a will, a bitter, cruel thing. He left everything to a cousin in Kansas with explicit instructions that you and Daniel were to receive nothing. Margaret's stomach tightened, but there was land. Valuable land in Kansas left to James by his father. And according to the lawyer, that land should have gone to Daniel as James's son. Ethan leaned forward, should have Catherine's face darken. James had a brother, Thomas Brennan. He survived the war, but he deserted. Changed his name to Thomas Crawford. He's been living in Colorado, she paused. And 3 days ago, I received word that he's filed a lawsuit. He's claiming that as Daniel's legal guardian, since Daniel is still a minor, he has the right to control Daniel's inheritance. Margaret felt ice settle in her chest. That's insane. Daniel is my son. I have custody. Catherine shook her head. The lawyer says it's complicated. The divorce was filed in this territory, but the land is in Kansas. Thomas is arguing that Kansas law doesn't recognize the divorce, that you're still legally James's wife, and that as James's brother and Daniel's uncle, he has guardianship rights over my dead body. Ethan's voice was steel. That might be what he's counting on. The lawsuit moved quickly. Thomas Brennan was not interested in justice. He was interested in money, and he had hired lawyers who knew how to exploit every legal loophole. Within weeks, Margaret and Ethan found themselves back in a courtroom, this time in Kansas, fighting for Daniel's future. The courtroom was cold and sterile with high ceilings and narrow windows. Thomas sat on the opposite side, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that held the same cruelty Margaret had seen in James. He looked at Daniel with something like contempt, and Margaret wanted to claw his eyes out. The proceedings were brutal. Thomas's lawyers argued that Margaret had kidnapped Daniel, that she had poisoned his mind against his father, that the divorce was fraudulent. They painted her as a manipulative woman who had seduced a lonely rancher and used him to escape her legal obligations. Margaret sat through it all. Her hands clenched in her lap, Ethan beside her, his jaw tight. Catherine sat behind them, and even Daniel was there sitting in the gallery, his young face pale but determined. And then Catherine's lawyer called Thomas to the stand. Mr. Brennan, you claim guardianship of your nephew, correct? That's right. The boy needs a man's guidance, someone from his real family. The lawyer nodded. And you believe you're qualified to provide that guidance? I do. The lawyer pulled out a document. Is it true that in 1871, a woman named Ellen Crawford filed for divorce against you, citing extreme physical abuse? Thomas's face went red. That's got nothing to do with this. Please answer the question. That woman was unstable. She lied. The lawyer held up another document. This is a medical report from a doctor in Denver. It states that Mrs. Crawford was treated for a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and severe bruising to her face and neck. The doctor noted that the injuries were consistent with severe physical assault. The courtroom went silent. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. 2 brothers, both monsters. The lawyer continued, his voice cold. And is it true that you were arrested twice for assault and battery during your time in Colorado? Thomas lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. You can't use that against me. That was years ago. The judge, an older man with kind eyes and a stern demeanor, slammed his gavel. Mr. Brennan, control yourself. He turned to the lawyers. I've heard enough. This court finds that Thomas Brennan is unfit for guardianship. His claim is denied. He looked at Daniel, his expression softening. Son, the land in Kansas is yours by right of inheritance. Your mother will hold it in trust until you reach majority. He turned back to Thomas, his voice hard as iron. And Mr. Brennan, if you come within 100 miles of this family, again, I will personally see you arrested for harassment. Thomas was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting, and Margaret felt her knees buckle. Ethan caught her holding her upright as relief and exhaustion washed over her in equal measure. That evening, they sat in a small boarding house room, all of them together. Daniel held the deed to the Kansas land, his 11-year-old hands struggling with the weight of it. What should I do with it? Ethan ruffled his hair. That's your decision, son, but you don't have to make it today. Daniel looked at Margaret, then at Catherine. I want to sell it, use the money for the ranch, and to make sure Catherine has a place here if she wants. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that. Margaret pulled both of them close, her children, one by blood, one by choice, and felt something in her chest finally truly heal. They returned to the ranch a week later, and Catherine settled into the small guest cabin. She took to ranch life with surprising ease, and within a year she had become as much a part of the family as anyone born into it. But peace, as Margaret had learned, was fragile. And just when she thought they had finally found it, the world shifted again. It started with a drought, but peace, as she had learned, was fragile. And just when she thought they had finally found it, the world shifted again. It started with a drought. The spring rains never came, and the summer sun beat down relentlessly, turning the prairie to dust. The crops withered. The well ran low. Ethan worked from dawn to dusk, trying to save what he could, but it was not enough. By August, they were rationing water. By September, they had sold half the livestock just to buy food. And by October, Ethan's face had taken on a haunted look, his worry etched deep into the lines around his eyes. One night, Margaret found him sitting at the table, his head in his hands. In front of him was a letter from the bank. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she read. "They're calling in the loan." His voice was hollow. "We have 60 days to pay it off or they take the ranch." Margaret sank into the chair beside him. "How much more than we have?" "More than we can make in 60 days. They sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down on them. This land, this home, it was all they had. Losing it would mean starting over again, and Margaret was not sure she had the strength for that. "What are we going to do?" He looked at her, his eyes red. "I don't know." The next morning, Margaret walked into town. She had an idea, a desperate one, but it was all she had. She went to the church and found Pastor Whitman in his office, bent over a sermon. "Margaret, what brings you here?" She sat down, her hands twisting in her lap. "I need help." She told him about the drought, about the loan, about the 60 days they had left. He listened, his face growing more troubled with each word. "How much do you need?" she told him, and he winced. "That's a lot of money." "I know, but I thought maybe if the church could loan us something, just enough to buy us time." He shook his head slowly. "The church doesn't have that kind of money. But maybe," he trailed off thinking, maybe we could organize a fundraiser, get the community involved. Why would they help us?" He smiled. "Because you're one of them now, and people here take care of their own." She wanted to believe him, but she had seen the way some people still looked at her with judgment and suspicion. She was not sure they would help, but she was wrong. Word spread quickly, and within days the women of the town had organized a barn dance. They sold tickets, auctioned off pies and quilts, and passed around a collection plate. Clara Matthews, who had once judged Margaret so harshly, donated a week's worth of sales from the feed store. Fletcher gave them 2 cows and offered to buy more of their livestock at above-market prices. The night of the dance, Margaret stood at the edge of the barn, watching people laugh and spin across the floor, and felt tears prick her eyes. These people, many of whom she barely knew, were fighting for her family, for her home. Ethan found her, pulling her into his arms. "Dance with me." She let him lead her onto the floor, and they moved together slowly, the music washing over them. When the dance ended and the final totals were counted, they had raised nearly half of what they needed. It was not enough, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Ethan sold everything they could spare. Tools, furniture. Even Margaret's wedding ring, though, Ethan protested. She insisted, her voice firm. "It's just metal. Our marriage is more than a ring." With the money from the fundraiser and the sales, they scraped together just enough to pay off the loan. The day they handed over the money to the bank, Margaret felt as though she could finally breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. The drought continued, and by the time winter came, they were barely scraping by. Food was scarce, money was scarcer, and the children, though they never complained, were always hungry. One night, as Margaret lay beside Ethan, she spoke into the darkness. "Maybe we should go to Wyoming." He turned his head. "What, Lena's husband, Samuel?" He said, "There's land, work. Maybe it's time to consider it." Ethan was silent for a long moment. "You'd leave here after everything we've fought for, if it means keeping our family fed?" "Yes." He pulled her close, his voice rough. "Let's give it one more year. If things don't get better, we'll go." She nodded, though she was not sure they had a year to give. But sometimes the world surprises you. The spring rains came heavy and relentless, turning the prairie green almost overnight. The crops flourished, the livestock fattened, and by summer they were not just surviving, they were thriving. Ethan rebuilt what they had lost. Margaret planted a bigger garden. Daniel, now 13, took on more responsibility, working alongside Ethan like a partner. And Lena, now a toddler, toddled around the yard, her laughter ringing out like bells. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Ethan spoke. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About how close we came to losing this, and how lucky we are to still be here." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "We didn't just get lucky. We fought." He smiled. "We did, and we won." She thought about that, about everything they had been through. The abuse, the fear, the trials, and the drought, and the near loss of everything. And she realized he was right. They had fought, and they had won. But more than that, they had survived. Not just physically, but as a family. They had built something real, something lasting out of nothing but hope and determination. "That's all anyone can ask for." She said it quietly, and he nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for." As the years passed, their life settled into a rhythm. Daniel grew into a young man, tall and strong, with Ethan's quiet strength and Margaret's fierce heart. He began courting a girl from town, a sweet-faced daughter of the blacksmith, and Margaret watched with pride as he stumbled through the awkwardness of first love. Lena grew too wild and bright with Ethan's sharp eyes and Margaret's stubborn streak. She climbed trees and chased chickens and refused to wear dresses, much to Margaret's exasperation and secret delight. Ethan's hair began to gray at the temples. Margaret found lines around her eyes that had not been there before, but they wore their age well, like badges earned through hard-won battles. One spring, a letter arrived from Wyoming. It was from Samuel and Lena's widower. He wrote that he was remarrying to a kind woman with children of her own, and that he was finally ready to move forward. He thanked Ethan for the letters over the years, for keeping Lena's memory alive. At the end, he wrote, "She would have been proud of the man you've become and the family you've built." Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with all the others. Margaret watched him, seeing the grief that still lingered, but also the acceptance. Some losses never fully healed, but they became bearable. That evening, as they worked in the garden together, Lena chasing butterflies nearby, Margaret spoke. "Do you ever regret it? Staying here instead of going to Wyoming?" He looked at her, his hands dirty with soil. "Not once, even when things were hard, especially then. Because we got through it together." She smiled, reaching over to wipe a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "We did, didn't we?" He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "We did, and we always will." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in the garden they had planted, watching their children play. The land stretched out around them, vast and unforgiving, but also beautiful. Theirs. Margaret thought about the girl she had been, broken and terrified, stranded on a frozen road with nothing but a child and a desperate hope. She thought about the man who had stopped, who had seen her not as a burden, but as someone worth saving. And she thought about the life they had built together, brick by brick, season by season, through drought and storm and everything in between. It had not been easy. It never would be. But it was theirs. And that was enough. More than enough. 10 years passed like pages turning in a book each season, a chapter each year, a testament to what could be built from ashes. Daniel married the blacksmith's daughter, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and steady hands. And they built a house on the south pasture, close enough to help with the ranch, but far enough to forge their own path. Within 2 years, they had given Margaret and Ethan their first grandchild, a boy they named Ethan Samuel. And Margaret wept when she held him, overwhelmed by the impossible gift of watching her son become a father. Lena grew tall and fierce with no interest in marriage or settling down. She learned to break horses, to read the weather, to fix machinery that even Ethan struggled with. She wore trousers instead of skirts and cut her hair short when it got in her way, and Margaret had long since stopped fighting her on it. The girl knew her own mind, and that was something Margaret could respect. The ranch prospered. Slowly at first, then, with gathering momentum. Ethan hired 2 ranch hands to help with the cattle, and they expanded their herd until it stretched across acres of grassland. The house was enlarged, a second bedroom added, then a third. The barn was rebuilt solid and strong. And the garden, Margaret's garden, became something of local legend, producing vegetables so abundant they sold the surplus in town. But beneath the surface of this prosperity, time was taking its toll. Ethan's limp grew more pronounced, the old injury from his youth compounded by years of hard labor. Some mornings he could barely rise from bed, his joints stiff and aching. Margaret's hands, once so nimble with needle and thread, began to curl with arthritis, making even simple tasks a challenge. They never spoke of it, this gradual decline. It felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that the bodies that had carried them through so much were finally wearing out. Instead, they adapted. Ethan let Daniel and the ranch hands take on more of the physical work. Margaret taught Lena to cook and preserve food, passing on the skills she had learned. Thomas lunged across the courtroom, his face twisted with rage, but the bailiffs caught him before he reached Daniel. He was dragged away, screaming obscenities, and Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. Finally, truly over. That evening, they sat in a small hotel room, all of them together. Daniel held the deed to the Kansas land, turning it over in his hands. "What are you going to do with it?" Catherine asked. Daniel looked at Margaret, then at Ethan. "Sell it. Use the money to buy more land here, to expand the ranch." He paused. "And to make sure Catherine has a home if she wants it." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that." Years had passed since the lawsuit. Catherine had become a permanent fixture on the ranch, living in the small cabin on the north pasture. She and Lena had grown close, the two women forming a bond that reminded Margaret of sisters. She took to ranch life with surprising ease, learning to work alongside Lena, the two women forming a bond that reminded Margaret of sisters. Daniel sold the Kansas land for more than they had expected, and with the money they bought the adjacent property, doubling the size of the ranch. They hired more hands, built new barns, and expanded the cattle herd until it was one of the largest in the territory. But for Margaret and Ethan, these victories felt different now, quieter. They were no longer young, no longer driven by the desperate need to prove themselves. They had proven enough, built enough, survived enough. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan spoke. "I've been thinking about something." Margaret smiled. "That's always dangerous." He laughed, then grew serious. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even Lena." She turned to him, concern flickering across her face. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "When I was in the war, I did things I'm not proud of. Killed men, burned homes, followed orders I knew were wrong." He paused, his hands trembling. "There was a night near the end. We were ordered to clear out a town suspected of harboring deserters. There was a family, a woman and her children. She begged us not to hurt them. And his voice broke. I turned away, told my commanding officer I didn't see anyone. Let them escape into the woods." He looked at her, his eyes wet. "I was court-martialed for it. Spent 6 months in a military prison. When I got out, I came home and found everything gone. My family scattered, my reputation destroyed." Margaret reached for his hand. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to know who I really am. Not the man who saved you. Not the hero everyone thinks. Just a man who made one good choice in a lifetime of bad ones." She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You made more than one good choice. You've made thousands. Every day you've chosen kindness. Every day you've chosen us." Her voice was fierce. "That's who you are, not what you did in the war. Not the mistakes you made, but the man who keeps choosing to do better." He pulled her close, and they sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. That night, as they lay in bed, Margaret spoke into the darkness. "I'm tired, Ethan." He turned to her. "What do you mean?" I'm tired of fighting. Tired of waiting for the next disaster. I want to just live, to enjoy what we have without always looking over my shoulder." He pulled her closer. "Then that's what we'll do." "Is it that simple?" "It can be." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe him. The years that followed were the best of Margaret's life. Not because they were easy, but because she had finally learned to be present in them. To notice the small joys, the way Lena laughed wild and free, the way Daniel looked at his son with a tenderness that still made her throat tight, the way Ethan's hand would find hers across the dinner table, a silent reminder that she was not alone. They celebrated holidays together, the whole extended family crowding into the ranch house. They marked birthdays and anniversaries, milestones, and ordinary Tuesdays. They fought sometimes because that was what families did, but they always came back together, bound by something stronger than blood. On Margaret's 50th birthday, the entire town threw her a party. She stood in the church hall, surrounded by people who had once judged her, who now called her friend, and felt overwhelmed by the impossible gift of belonging. Pastor Whitman, now elderly and stooped, raised a glass in her honor. "To Margaret Calloway, a woman who showed us all what it means to survive with grace." Everyone cheered, and Margaret found herself crying not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. Ethan found her later standing alone on the church steps looking out at the town. "You all right?" She nodded. "I'm just thinking about how different my life could have been. If you hadn't stopped that day. If you hadn't cared." He wrapped his arm around her. "I'll never regret stopping." "I know, but I need you to understand something." She turned to him. "You didn't save me. You gave me the chance to save myself," he smiled. "Then I'm glad I could do that." They stood together, watching the stars emerge one by one, and Margaret thought about the girl she had been broken and terrified. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, the pain and the loss and the moments of grace that had somehow been enough to build a life on. She thought about Daniel now, a man with children of his own. About Catherine, who had found family when she thought she had none. About Lena, who would never know the fear Margaret had lived with because they had made sure of it. And she thought about Ethan, this man who had chosen her every single day, even when it would have been easier to walk away. "I love you." She said it simply, no grand declaration, just a statement of fact. "I love you too." He said it back just as simply, and that Margaret realized was enough. Not the dramatic gestures, not the sweeping romance, just the quiet certainty that tomorrow and the day after and all the days to come they would choose each other again. 23 years after Margaret first arrived at Ethan's ranch, half frozen and desperate, she stood in the same spot where he had first seen her. The wagon was long gone, reclaimed by the earth, but the ditch remained a scar in the landscape, a reminder of where everything had begun. Ethan stood beside her, his hair now fully gray, his face lined with the years. They had come here on a whim, driven by nostalgia and the desire to see it one last time. "Can you believe it's been so long?" She shook her head. "Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." He pointed to the spot where the wheel had broken. "I remember seeing you standing there, thinking you looked like the wind might blow you away. I thought I was going to die out here." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." They stood in silence, watching the sun move across the sky. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Any regrets?" She thought about it. About the hardships. About the fights with James, with the law, with poverty and drought, and all the things that had tried to break them. About the scars, both physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. And then she thought about Daniel and Sarah and their 3 children. About Catherine, who had become the daughter she never knew she needed. About Lena, fierce and independent and holy herself. About the ranch, thriving and strong. About the community they had built, the friends they had made, the life they had created from nothing. "Not one." Ethan smiled. "Me neither." They walked back to the wagon hand in hand and rode home as the sun set behind them. Home to the house they had built together. Home to the family they had made. Home to the life they had fought for and earned and would cherish until their last breath. That night as they lay in bed, Margaret spoke into the darkness. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when our time comes, whenever that is, you won't be sad. Because we did it, Ethan. We built something beautiful." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick. "I promise, but I'm going to miss you anyway." She smiled. "Good. That means it mattered." And it did matter. Every moment of it, every hardship overcome, every small victory celebrated. Every choice to keep going, keep fighting, keep loving, even when the world said they should give up. Years later, when Margaret was 72 and her body finally gave out, she died peacefully in her sleep, Ethan's hand in hers. He followed her 6 months later, his heart simply unable to keep beating without her. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch where they could watch the land they had loved stretch out into forever. Their grandchildren tended the graves, planting wildflowers that bloomed every spring, a riot of color against the green. And on their shared headstone, carved in simple letters, were the words that Daniel had chosen. They didn't speak of the past anymore. They lived. It was Catherine who told the story to the youngest grandchildren, the ones who had never known their grandparents. She told them about a woman who had been broken and a man who had seen past the breaking, about how they had built a life together brick by brick, season by season, against all odds. She told them that love was not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up, day after day, year after year, choosing each other even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And she told them that they came from strong stock, from people who had survived the unsurvivable, and that strength, that resilience lived on in them. The children listened wide-eyed, and Catherine smiled, seeing in their faces echoes of Margaret and Ethan. The legacy they had left behind was not measured in land or money, though there was plenty of both. It was measured in the lives they had touched, the family they had built, the proof that even in the darkest moments, there was always a choice to be made, to give up or to keep going, to hate or to love, to let the past define you or to write your own future. Margaret and Ethan had chosen the harder path, the one that required faith when there was no reason for it, the one that demanded they believe in tomorrow even when today was unbearable. And in choosing that path, they had shown everyone who came after that survival was not enough, that it was possible to do more than just endure. It was possible to heal, to grow, to thrive. It was possible to take the broken pieces of your life and build something whole. It was possible to love and be loved in return. And that in the end was the greatest gift of all.